Hey, welcome back. In this lesson we'll take a look at the console panel. Note, this isn't strictly the console panel itself, but rather the ability to inject JavaScript into the current page. So I've already got a few scripts lined up to show you, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of take some from here and paste it in here just so you can see. But with what we're going to cover, keep in mind that the console and the snippets feature in the sources panel is very similar. I've already shown this, but just to give you a little taste of what is possible, if I run this snippet, we get a list of colors which are used on the current page. So there are some very cool snippets out there and you can find them at this repository. Okay, I'm going to clear what's in the current console by hitting the clear button. I'm going to close this tab. To start out, let's run this script. I'm using the shortcut Command and Enter, but you can also right click and select Run. First off, this is just to demonstrate the console.error feature and how it gives you a stack trace of the calls which led up to the current error. As you can see, error function wrapper was called, and that calls error function, and that is reflected here. And keep in mind, the ability to click on the line number still works with snippets. Next, we've got console.group. This is a nice way to make your log messages a bit more tidy if you are logging a large amount. You call console.group and pass a string. That string is the title of your group. From that point on, all subsequent log messages will be part of that group. Finally, when you're done, you can call console.groupEnd. You might notice how one of the log messages is in green. This is made possible with a %c modifier. When you use %c, you can pass some arbitrary CSS as a second argument. Note that you are limited in what CSS properties you can use here. And finally, as part of the console API, this is console.time. As you can see, you call console.time and console.timeEnd with the same string. Everything in between is timed. So here I've got a very simple for loop which is not doing anything whatsoever, but this I variable still has to increment. Here it took 0.813 milliseconds. If I add a few zeros, as you can see it took significantly longer. So this is a really good snippet for profiling your code. Now what we've just looked at isn't an exhaustive list of what's in the console API. I just wanted to give you a taste of a few things that are available. If you do a search for Developer Tools Console API, you'll find the official documentation which has a heap of examples. Okay, now let's look at the command line API. Did you know you can use $0 to get the currently selected element in the Elements panel? Right now I don't have any elements selected, so let's go to the Elements panel, make sure one's selected, come back, and I'll rerun that, and as you can see it's showing me the currently selected element, which is really useful. I can also right click and select Reveal in Elements panel to go back to the Elements panel. So we'll go back, and I want to show you this. If you've used jQuery you might be familiar with this. In the DevTools this is simply an alias to query selector. So here I'll select the first anchor tag. Okay, cool. Now as you might have noticed, we do get autocomplete in the console panel, and this is great for exploring what properties and what methods are available on an object. But what about the previous command I ran? Why didn't I get a value for that? That's because this isn't defined yet. This is a method we are calling. So here's a little trick. You can use the shortcut $_ to get the value of the last evaluated bit of code. And because $_ is now defined, I can actually do dot, and suddenly I do get autocomplete. So that's a little shortcut. Calling the inspect method is basically the same as right-clicking on a DOM node here and selecting Reveal in Elements panel. GetEventListeners is really powerful. It allows you to pass a DOM node to the function GetEventListeners, and in return, let me just clear this, and in return we get a list of event listeners which are registered on the DOM node we passed in. Here I can see key down. Here's the listener, but this isn't very helpful. Function E. So what I can actually do here is right click and select Show Function Definition. And as you can see, I'm taken straight to the piece of code which registered the event listener on this web page. So that's it from the command line API. Keys is a handy one to know. You pass an object and it will simply list all the keys in an array. Likewise, there's also a values function which will return all the values of an object you pass in. Monitor events is another really good one to know. Let's say you want to know what the event object looks like in your callback. For example, when you add an event listener to scrolling. Well, here we pass the object in question and we pass the event we want to listen for. I'll execute that, and notice when I start scrolling, all the events are logged. So this is a really quick way to register an event listener on an object. By the way, like in many panels of the DevTools, you can use Command F to do a search. So here I'll search for scroll, and that's showing up here. Now if you've noticed, a lot of what we've just been covering is really good for debugging from the outside in. For example, GetEventListeners is super useful when you don't know what event listeners the current page has registered. I want to show you something cool. Using object.observe, we can actually pause at the V8 debugger every time a property is changed on an object that we care about. So I'm going to execute this bit of code. Now I have this watch me variable in the global scope. I'm going to change a property of it. And as you can see, just like that, the debugger has paused. And this is really useful, as you can imagine, when you really want to find out how an object is being modified. Now this is good for setting values. What about getting values? I'm going to continue here, go to prop access. Here's a little trick. Using object.defineProperty, we can find out whenever a property is accessed, which is incredibly powerful. Remember in the timeline panel lesson how we were noticing that certain retrieval of property values can cause all sorts of performance issues. For example, getting an element's offset can cause a recalculate style. Let me execute this bit of code. Now let's say I access the scroll top property of the document.body object. What's going to happen? As you can see, because we've defined a custom getter and setter, the debugger has successfully paused. So the command and console API aside, I hope you've seen a few interesting techniques at which we can use to debug our JavaScript code. Don't forget, this is all documented. Oh, and by the way, as for the console panel itself, I brought this up by hitting the escape key and it's available as part of this drawer. And you can also choose the context at which you wish your JavaScript to be evaluated in. So this is useful for when you have iframes. And finally, there's this filter option. You can filter by the type of console message and even supply some custom regex.